I want to start off by asking if I could see a show of hands who hasn't tried ChatGPT or a similar AI tool, or someone really, okay. Impressive, all right. There's one person. So, I mean, ever since, I know hopefully nobody on stage, but ever since November 2022, we've been in this, extraordinary moment. I've covered AI for a very long time, and it's very clear that this is a transformative, remarkable technology. It's been adopted faster than anything in history, and yet we're also seeing a lot of uncertainty about it. We see predictions for the economic impact of generative AI ranging from a few percent per year to up to 30% over the next 10 years. And there's a great deal of uncertainty from lots of people, from the general public. So I want to kick things off by getting into some of that uncertainty. So Catherine, if you could maybe start off by helping us understand, why do you think people are so uncertain about how this is going to impact the economy?
Oh, well, I think it makes perfect sense why there's so much uncertainty. I think it's probably one of the greatest technological shifts of our time, certainly of my lifetime. But I think we're going to look back and say that it's bigger than the internet. And I think that's okay. There's going to be lots of changes. There's going to be lots of changes in job creation and how we interface as humans with the rest of the world. The human-to-machine sort of relationship, I think, is fundamentally going to shift. So I think it's fine that there's uncertainty. But I'm actually very excited about it. So I work in the physical world. The companies that I invest in, we call it American Dynamism, are companies that support the national interests. But often they're building in the physical world. And in my belief on what I think is going to happen, where AI is going to have the greatest impact, is I actually think it's going to have the greatest impact in the physical world. And I think that's a little bit contrarian, but if you're paying attention to what's happening in venture capital right now, I'd say there's two really, really hot sectors that have blown up in venture capital, especially at the early stage. One is everything related to AI, both on the infrastructure side and on the application layer, but then also everything that's happening in the physical world. And my view actually comes from a founder I talked to 2 days ago, where I asked him, he's building in a construction space, an AI-enabled construction company, and I said, are you hiring software engineers? And he said, actually, no. I don't think I'm going to have to hire a single software engineer for a very long time, but I need chemists, I need chemical engineers, I need physicists, I need mechies, I need everything else. And if you look at what happened with stagnation since the 70s, you saw everyone sort of leave those fields and go to the digital world. We have had so much digital innovation over the last 50 years. That's been the entire story of the 21st century in terms of technology, economic growth. And I think what's going to happen is a lot of the talent that oversaturated into that computer science degree, into that becoming a programmer, is now realizing that the real opportunity is leveraging AI in the physical world, and that working on hardware is actually where the opportunity is, rather than competing with these, I would say, vastly improving AI that's taking over a lot of the keyboard jobs. And so I think if we look 25 years in the future, at the next quarter of the century, we're going to see just an explosion of building that looks a lot more like the 19th century, and that the physical world will be fundamentally transformed. And that a lot of innovation will have moved away from the digital world, at least human innovation, right? But humans working with AI to improve the physical world. And so I think that's why you're seeing so much enthusiasm for these American Dynamism companies.
That's fascinating. I mean, yeah, we'll get into coding and AI in a little bit. Even the person who hasn't used ChatGPT, you may not realize it, but you're now a proficient software vibe coder. You can code some stuff. You should try it.
Yes.
But perhaps, Secretary Chow, if you could talk about, this obviously this technology is moving so quickly, and there is a great deal of uncertainty about what the impact is going to be like on productivity as well as jobs. How does that complicate the picture from the government standpoint?
Well, as being the former Secretary of Transportation and Secretary of Labor, I have seen how technology can really empower the workforce, but it can also be a tremendous disruptor. What you are seeing now, and not putting any political spin on anything, is that the government is pretty much the last place where disruption has not occurred, and it is now occurring. But what we're seeing also is all these changes will take time, because supposedly $7 trillion in increased GDP is to be added. And yet productivity gains have only been about 1.2% for the last 10 years. I want to be optimistic about this new world that we are entering in. And as Catherine mentioned, it is not just an upgrade of IT, it is a whole transformation of the way we move, work, and live. And the imperative is, how do we equip, how do we prepare our people, our citizens, our residents, our workforce to be able to adapt to these changes? What we're seeing is that, majority, 88% of CEOs say that they're working on AI already. And yet only 38% of workers feel as if they are ready to deal with all of this new technology. And there will be winners and losers. We will see a change in the way we work. And those who will probably have greater duration are those that occupations which show innovation, strategic vision. The C-suite, for example, leading in an era of uncertainty, and also creativity. If you're a fashion artist or a creative artist, or something that requires creativity, technology can lead, but it won't spark influencers, let's say. And then we're going to see those who are in the traditional type of analysis, kind of rote interpretation, translation. I think that's going to be taken over. So how do we help our workforce adapt to these sometimes very scary changes? And we want to do so in a way that doesn't impair new innovation and the trends toward innovation. So I always say the government's role is to engage responsibly with emerging technologies to address legitimate public concerns about safety, security, and privacy without hampering innovation. And one last point, going on to innovation, let's take a look at AVs, autonomous vehicles. When I was Secretary of Transportation, I made a small change in the guidelines and regulations as to what defined a driver. All you had to say, and all we did was to say, the definition of a driver can include not only a human being, but an automated driving system. Now that in itself took 6 months, okay? Because you have to go out for comment and period and remarks, and then you have to rewrite the whole thing. But with that small change, that actually tremendously spurred the development of the autonomous vehicles. So government has tremendous authority and power, and we need to make sure that the government is acting to have guardrails, but not hamper innovation, which is, again, a tremendous American hallmark.
Yeah, the self-driving car, the autonomous car analogy is a great one. I think there was relatively little regulation. There wasn't too much around that. Do you think that that is something we ought to be trying to replicate here? Because there's a lot of talk about regulation.
Again, the first rule for government is do no harm. And so we want to ensure that innovation prevails because that's who we are as Americans. And then we also need to make sure that there is consistent and harmonized regulations. So this state-by-state patchwork of regulations is actually quite damaging.
Right.
And for insurance, in this example, how autonomous vehicles can operate, we are needing a national kind of system or protocol of regulations. And it's happening already, but autonomous vehicles are only 5% of vehicles. And one may ask, why is that? I've always said consumer acceptance will determine the rate of advancement of these new technologies. If those of you that are so smart in this field, pushing all this, involved in developing all these new innovations, if you do not communicate with the rest of the country and explain your enthusiasm and your concern about safety, security, and privacy, that will be a factor in why there's not greater consumer acceptance and greater distribution of this technology in our economy. Okay, great.
Well, so I want to go back to the idea of this wave coming, and I'm not to pour cold water on it too much, but if you look at the economic data, there's not much job displacement currently, and also there is an S&P report that came out saying that 47% of companies were abandoning their generative AI projects. So I want to turn to Elad because I think you work and have worked within tech companies for a long time. What do you see that's showing you that this is a profound technology that will affect things?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think that if you look at the standard hype cycle, everybody gets incredibly excited about technology. They say enormous change is coming. They say all these jobs will get displaced. And then it's kind of a bit of a yawn for a couple years as mainly startups grow off of the technology. Although I think in this case, there's lots of examples of very large existing companies actually adopting technology at scale and already using it. And we can talk about that in a minute. But I think ultimately it takes many years for an enterprise or for a big organization, a government, et cetera, to adopt it. And mobile is a good example. You look at the very first mobile application for Bank of America, and I think that came out in 2009, 2010, and it was a very bad interface. It would break half the time. You couldn't really do much on it. You had trouble logging in.
Yeah.
And today you can walk up to an ATM and push and click on your phone and take out money, or take a picture of a check and it'll automatically put it into your account. There's all these things you can suddenly do, but it took a decade. And so usually these transformations take a while to propagate, particularly for the biggest organizations, which are often the most important organizations. And then in parallel, you have startups just growing really fast against this.
Yeah.
If you actually look at revenue or revenue figures or usage, utilization of this technology is actually immense in terms of the rate of adoption. So you look at the number of ChatGPT users over the last 2 years, it's rumored to be in the high hundreds of millions. If you look at revenue, Microsoft, for example, in its last quarter for Azure said that it had a $28 billion or so quarter. I think 15% of that was AI. So if you think about that, that's billions of dollars a quarter being generated just on one cloud. So I actually think the technology adoption has been very fast this time around. It doesn't quite feel like it's propagated, which is true, but I think the big change is going to take a decade, and we're really going to see that substantiate.
Would you have a... Oh, go ahead.
I actually see that as very positive.
Yeah.
That means that we as a society, have time to begin to start thinking about this in a very profound and effective way, and get our people ready for it. So I think that's actually quite positive.
Yeah, no, we have time.
So Elad, would you have advice for companies that are maybe struggling to get their AI to work?
Yeah, it always goes in a couple waves, right? You have a few people inside the organization kind of play around with it, you prototype, you talk about it. And then often, to be honest, it takes a few years for an organization to shift the way it works enough around a technology. That happened with the internet. That happened with mobile. It's always kind of the same thing where you, in some cases, literally have to change how your organization works. And the promise of this AI is it's very good at understanding language. This wave of generative AI is very good at understanding language. It's good at understanding images. And that really suggests that there's certain jobs that it's going to augment the best. People talk a lot about coding, but if you look at back office business processes, you look at legal, you look at accounting, you look at sales management, you look at a variety of things, this technology is going to be very important for those sorts of fields. And you already start to see it getting adopted. And so it's back to do also have, at least for a large organization, the change management practices needed to say, hey, actually, we can make each person on our customer success team 5 times more effective. But how do we change the nature of that work? How do we change the nature of that organization to make sure that we can support that?
Yeah, I was talking to Block, the finance company, and they've developed their own agentic tool and got everybody to use it because they were thinking this is going to be a big deal. And that seemed like a very impressive way to kind of accelerate innovation there. So Evan, your company is doing amazing stuff with AI, and the supply chain is obviously a huge topic in of itself, but I know you have thoughts on how AI is going to change productivity and work. What do you see from what you're doing?
So we're a technology company. We write our own software to apply artificial intelligence across the world's largest network of supply chain data to map it all out and solve different supply chain related problems. We're on the front line of AI adoption as a software company using agentic flows and other tools to code. And so, the question is, are we now preparing to fire our software engineers or not?
Right.
And the answer is no, right? So we're just going to build more product more quickly and create more value. And I think some version of that is going to be the storyline. Of course, there's going to be disruption. Of course, there's going to be job displacement, but there's going to be a productivity miracle. We're already seeing it, on the front lines as early adopters. And you'll be able to create more goods and services more quickly with the same base of labor. And remember, we have today a unemployment rate that's at near historic lows. So I'm not so worried about this massive wave of disruption and job loss. It will happen. There will be industries that are more or less impacted, but the net new job creation and the pace of that job creation, I think I'm very optimistic about.
That's great. I should say you can submit questions if you want to. They'll appear on this iPad if I don't manage to lock it. So you go ahead and do that. So the coding example is really fascinating because this is one of those jobs that was seen as sort of a secure career path and very high skilled, and yet we have people like Dario at Anthropic saying that there's going to be tons of the 90% of code is going to be written by coders, and they won't need so many coders. I think it's telling they did say that at a developer conference myself. And I've been looking at this quite closely. I feel like, so Elad, do you think that coders are going to disappear, or they'll change the nature of that work?
It's kind of interesting because in general, if you look at coding as a discipline or a field, there's millions of practitioners globally. Mm-hmm. And some of them are very good and some of them are less skilled, just like any other job or labor force or anything else. And so the question is, what is this technology going to augment the most first? And then eventually, what is it going to displace the most? Mm-hmm. And I think what it augments the most is the very best and the very worst developers to some extent. It provides tools for the people who aren't as strong in terms of being able to do things quicker or more easily or in an automated fashion. And then it gives enormous leverage to the best people.
Yeah.
And if you think about it from a long-term trend perspective, there should be some form of displacement of what we consider coding today, which is actually writing lots and lots of lines of code. Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty inevitable. And the question is less of if and more of a when. Right, is that a 3-year thing? Is that a 10-year thing? It'll eventually happen. And there's a lot of different jobs that we have displaced in the past that we don't really talk about anymore. Yeah. And we can make a long list of those. The sort of most ridiculous one is apparently there used to be operators for elevators. Right. And then eventually that got displaced. So there are jobs that will go away.
There still are.
Yeah. And so, fundamentally, I do think that a lot of what we think of as sort of day-to-day coding will go away at some point. And then the question is, does that unlock the potential for anybody to sit down and build an application or a program, and is that coding? Yeah. At that point, is it business creation? Is it job? Like, what are you doing, and what should you call that role? Uh-huh. And so I do think we're going to have a shift, but I do think there'll be all sorts of very large-scale displacement for all sorts of fields over time, for sure. Yeah.
And a really interesting question, I think, is whether this translates to other areas of the economy, other kinds of knowledge work. And one thing that I've heard economists worry about, and even some people cite, is that you may have some junior developers or management consultants lose some of the skills that they would develop through practice. I think so. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really interesting because when I did diligence on a company called Harvey that I backed, which is, I think, really emerging as the main AI legal company. Yeah. And so they basically provide tools for law firms to be able to, do various aspects of their work with different types of tooling more rapidly, et cetera. And so I called a lot of the CEOs of these law firms as part of this, and they work with many of the top 10 sort of law firms in the world. And I was surprised by what they were saying, because usually law firms don't adopt technology rapidly, right? They're usually a very slow adopter. And in this case, they're adopting Harvey incredibly rapidly. And I said, what is the thing that worries you the most about this technology? And they said, we think the number of associates we're going to have should shrink. Not the number of partners, but the number of associates. And so if we have 1/10 as many associates eventually, how do we think about career progression? How do we train them? What do they learn? What do they pick up over time? And so it's a shift in terms of how you actually think about your human capital that persists, and how do you train it, and how do you get it to the next level if the day-to-day job they normally would have done goes away? What does that mean?
I actually think that's the most interesting point on this, because we're talking a lot about coders and programmers, and what's interesting about that profession is a lot of those people don't go to college. They don't take out $200,000 of debt to get their job at Google. A lot of them are just very good at coding. But legal is actually, I think, the best example of this, where, as you said, if you only need 1/10 of the associates, but the universities aren't shrinking their class sizes to 1/10. You have a lot of people in America who were told that law is a profession where if you work very hard, you spend $200,000 to get your degree, you're going to have a job waiting for you at the end of that. And if those jobs aren't there, that actually is something where the credentialed class will rebel. And you do see AI affecting, I think we talk about it in terms of high skill work or low skill work, but I actually think it has a lot more to do with credential and the investment that people put into that credential, expecting that there will be a job and that there will be steadiness on the other end of that. And I think the people who are going to do the best and the jobs that are going to be created out of AI are actually ones that fluctuate in chaos. Like entrepreneurship is going to flourish because of AI. It is like AI is just going to help anyone who wants to become a small business owner or an entrepreneur in this country thrive, because the cost of the things that you need and the friction to start a business is going to zero. But if you're someone who wanted to go to law school, who has that debt and says, okay, I want to become a lawyer and I just want to go work at my local law firm, that job isn't there. And I do think that would be a mindset shift for the last 30, 40 years of how we think about what a high skill job is and a credential job is coming out of the university system. My belief is that AI is going to disrupt the university system more than anything, because the way that we have translated education credentials is not going to be relevant in an AI ecosystem and an AI-enabled world.
I think that's a great point. I was just going to bring up education because I think you can see this the enormous freak out and enormous impact. There's been stories about people not handing their homework in because ChatGPT was down, and so on. And but I actually think those students are probably the ones who are experimenting and figuring out how to use this technology much better than anybody else. And I don't know if you all know this, but the FAA at one point had to require pilots to fly manually because they become so good at relying on autopilot that when something went wrong, they weren't able to cope. And so I wonder, Secretary Chow, we were talking a little bit before about when you were just talking about the impact this is likely to have. What do you think? How should we think about this in education?
I think Catherine makes an excellent point. It's not only in legal, investment banking, all these analysis, all these analysts in the government. There's so many policy analysts in the government. So we have to take a look. I mean, you've mentioned that there will be job displacement. So what is the societal responsibility? What is the government's responsibility? As of now, the US government has about 34 different agencies that administer training programs, spending well over $28 billion. And I don't have the most recent numbers, but these were the ones that I have. And how are we going to deal with training and retraining, reskilling a whole swath of the population that will be reflective, actually, of educational levels as well? And how do we, as a society, address those who will be left behind? Because there will be those who are left behind, and that's a hard fact. Not only how do we transition them, but how do we manage those and respond to the needs of those who will be there for a quite long time. So I think that's a large societal issue and societal responsibility that the government is going to have to deal with, because the government is a reflection of all of you and of our citizens and residents. And as this uncertainty mushrooms, if it does, and as there's greater dislocation with a populist movement that is now so prevalent in our country and worldwide, these will have major significant societal impacts, government policies impact as well. So it's a lot to think about, which is why it's good that we have the time.
I don't know if we can bring up the slide that we have down here, but there's so there's a survey that the Reagan Institute just did where they were looking at many things related to this event, but this is attitudes towards artificial intelligence. And I think given how incredible this technology is and given how the projections for economic growth are so huge, there is, quite clearly you can see from this huge trepidation from people. But I want to ask if folks have an idea of where this comes from. Is this just about jobs? Evan, what do you think? Is it purely jobs, or has the discussion around AI become kind of negative by default?
I was invited to give testimony for the Senate. It was a bipartisan hearing on AI safety. Mm-hmm. This was a couple years ago. And I was sat next to your boss. And if you remember, the tone at the time was, killer robots, Terminator, massive job loss, the non-aligned runaway AI is going to, disrupt everything. I think Some of that was in the zeitgeist. It was a moment in time. You had Elon out there for various reasons, trumpeting a very kind of scary storyline with a lot of downside. My argument was, and my advice to the Senate was, we can't possibly, the government can't possibly regulate against all possible bad permutations of a future application of this technology. And we have an almost perfect track record of screwing that up when we try, right? Like look at the financial regulations and too big to fail and so on. So rather, at this moment, you have the macro frame is you have what I really, truly, in my bones believe, a great power competition where, you know, it's playing out in the supply chain, which is where I spend my time. It's also playing out in the artificial intelligence race.
Yeah.
And if you believe that AI is going to be the commanding heights of the 21st century, and you believe that the AI platform that gets deployed around the world is going to be the way to sort of manage and communicate values, and if you believe in something like a techno-dollar, which I am increasingly believing in, then the point is, like, the United States has to be accelerating into this. And I do believe there are potential downsides to worry about, right? So don't hear that. What I'm saying is we can't possibly know and anticipate and prevent all possible bad things in the future. So the stance we should be taking now is how do we maximize the probability that the good things that we're trying to win on come true, right? The very positive applications of AI, the economically transformational applications of AI, how do we accelerate into those? And I believe government does have a role to play in just that, right? Government can be a massive buyer. Government has some of the largest data holdings on Earth. So economics, supply chain, healthcare, education, defense, right? Those data holdings could be leveraged to accelerate into these beneficial applications and to guide the development of those technologies. It's going to take some amount of public-private partnership, but to guide the development of those technologies so that more of the positive future comes true, right? As opposed to worrying and trying to anticipate all possible bad versions of the future.
Yeah.
We currently have a skill gap right now.
Right.
I mean, most of the employers that I talk to, their number one concern is finding the appropriate talent. And yet there are millions of people who are looking for jobs at any one time and unable to latch onto the jobs of that they wish because of the current skills gap. And so the question is whether AI is going to exacerbate that gap or whether it will reduce it. But at the very minimum, I think there needs, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds, although if you're interested, I'm more than glad to, with the training programs that the government has, and should be done in conjunction with the private sector. I mean, private companies should be thinking about how do they educate their own workforce, existing workforce, and how do they adapt? Because the cost of hiring a new worker, reskilling, you know, it's actually quite expensive. The transitional cost is very high, so you might as well just try to train the workers that you have. And with the government, they should be entering into public-private partnerships where they're actually training for real jobs that exist. Right now, government training programs are 2 years in duration, when nobody can take 2 years out of the workforce. And we have also, you know, so we need to shorten the training programs. We actually need to consider something that has become a verboten word. We need to think about vouchers, giving government assistance in some kind of portable way to workers so that they can select for themselves what kinds of training that they need, that they want, and let them decide. And then we have also learned from past transition programs, transfer programs, that sometimes if these programs are overly generous, we actually disincentivize the workforce from transitioning to another job. So these assistance programs need to be thoughtful. They need to be helpful. They need to address the needs of those who need them, but not too much. So that balance in these training programs, as I mentioned, one, shorten them. Two, give those who are qualified and eligible vouchers. And then, you know, number three is to understand that any kind of assistance programs needs to be effective, needs to be just the right amount of assistance and not too much, not too few either.
Yeah, so Catherine, your boss Mark has written about the enormous potential of AI and how we should have this attitude towards American dynamism.
Yeah.
And I think that it's very true that it's somewhat it has been somewhat polarized. How do you sort of inspire people when there is this worry? I think that's one of the key questions: is how do we get people to kind of maybe it's using the technology more or something?
Well, I think the discourse has changed fundamentally since 2023 to 2025. And I actually want to go back to the national security point, because I think now there's a recognition. There were previous questions of, is artificial intelligence good? Job displacement? That feels like it was a conversation we were having 18 months ago. And then I think, this administration in particular, Vice President Vance laid out what I would call the seminal AI, sort of America's view on how we build AI. And it was from a national security perspective. We are in an arms race with China. It is not going to slow down. It is not going to stop. They are near peer on AI. We do have an advantage, but it's a small advantage. And we have to think about three things when we're developing AI policy. The first is we want to make America the best. We want AI dominance, American AI dominance, but we want that dominance globally. So we want to build products in America, and we want to share it with all of our allies. Two, we have to build the underlying supply chain for all of the products needed. So that's energy, that's all of the component products. We need to be building the physical things that power AI, and we have to be the leader of the world in that as well, which is again, that's the physical world. That's different than just the applications that sit on top of the AI, which we've been talking about a lot. But the third thing he said, and I think this is incredibly important, and this will be probably dominating the political conversation for the next 20 years, is that labor has to have a seat at the table when these decisions are being made. And I think if you remember those three things, and I think it goes back to Alad's point that we have time, this is not something where you're going to see massive job loss tomorrow, but that you need to have the human conversation of how do we protect those who are left behind, how do we think about that and retrain them and do the things in the right way, but also recognizing that we don't have a choice. This is not we can just stop the clock, we can do the 6 months pause. That was 2 years ago when we were sort of living in fairyland. Like now we actually realize that we have a near-peer adversary and we don't want Chinese AI dominating the globe. And so I think the national security point on this has been put at the forefront. And I understand that it seems like 50% of people are concerned, and the other 50% of people on the chart are either optimistic or have no kind of no views on it, which I always think it's interesting. I want to talk to people who have no views on it because I think they're probably most representative of most Americans. Most Americans don't think about technology, they use it, and they like it. And I actually think the consumer will have a much, much bigger voice in where AI goes than any of the conversations that we're having here today.
Okay, I want to, we can talk a bit more about the international picture, but I wanted to just very briefly bring up agentic AI, which you've probably heard is the latest buzzword, but for me it's actually a very exciting and important idea because it's about getting AI not just to talk to you through a chatbot window, but actually do things. Which if you want to have you want to think about usefulness, this is really what you want. So, Elad, you were working with some companies doing. Can you explain agentic AI better than I just did?
Oh, sure. I mean, agentic AI, to your point, is AI that will go and do actions on your behalf. So the difference is, for example, you can chat with ChatGPT and ask it, what are some fun places to go in, Florida, and it's very different from it then going and booking the actual trip for you or scheduling it for you or finding the flights and the hotel rooms and the reservations. So actually taking actions on your behalf. So more and more AI companies have now started building out these agentic tools, which allow you to not only ask, but also do deeper tasks. Very early examples of that may be some of the deep research projects or deep learning projects where you can go in and ask for it to go and look up literature and synthesize it for you around different topics. So Google and OpenAI and Perplexity and a number of companies have those sorts of tools right now. There's a company called called Cognition, which has an AI coding agent called Devin, which does this for code. So it'll help if you want to migrate a system or do other things that are more complex than just help auto-complete some code for me, which is what most of the coding companies do today. So eventually the belief is that you'll have this world where the AI will have some form of memory, so it remembers what you asked and it remembers what steps is taken for you. It has the ability to act recursively, so it can go back and do task after task. And then it has some form of reasoning capabilities, so it can adjudicate on its own you said that you wanted a trip to Florida, but let me actually make sure that these are the 3 cities you wanted to go to, and let me confirm it and double check it, and then maybe even suggest some things to you versus just being a passive piece of all this. And so I think right now there's sort of the hype and the reality. The reality is that there's a handful of companies that can do really simple tasks for you that I think are actually already quite useful. The reality is this is still a couple years away in terms of really being a large-scale area, and the hype part of it is every company now selling to enterprise claims they have agents whether they change their product or not. Right. Because it's kind of the fun marketing and sales thing to talk about, and everybody's very excited about agentic AI and adopting it and everything else. But I think this is the real promise, and so one way to think about where AI is heading, right now we're thinking about it as some tooling. Eventually you're going to be buying units of human labor. And you'll be buying different units of human labor online. You're going to be buying legal labor. You're going to be buying accounting labor. You're going to be buying coding. You're going to be buying units of time with these highly complex bots running in the cloud that will be doing work on your behalf. And some of that will be very deep work. And so if you think about what you have right now in ChatGPT or Perplexity or some of these other tools, you basically have an intern. It's very eager. It's trying to get things done. It kind of screws things up and you have to correct it, right? You're like, don't do that again, please. And if you curse at it, it says, please don't curse at me, right? And then what we're moving towards is eventually it's going to be like a very good new grad, and then it's going to be like somebody with a couple years experience, and it's going to get better and better with these capabilities, and eventually you're like, I'm going to trust you to go book this thing or do this work on my behalf. But I think the big transition mentally that at least I've gone through over the last year or two about thinking about this stuff is it's not just about tooling, it's about units of labor that we're eventually going to be buying for different forms of labor. And that's really the big, I think, revolution that's happening here.
Can I add to that just quickly? Because I do think this is why it's possible we will have a small business renaissance. Because when you look at companies like Shopify and Stripe, which I'd say are sort of the first companies in this iteration of how do you open up the internet and all of the world to small business owners that live on Main Street, it's like they opened up the tooling for payments. They opened up the marketplace. But labor is the big unlock when you think of, okay, if you're a small business owner, how do you buy units of labor? And so when all of that cost goes close to zero, the friction to start a new business is incredibly low. And so I think we're just going to see the small business, like a real Main Street small business, not venture back, but small business renaissance, where people are building because it's very easy to build. And so we're going to see a lot of labor actually move to entrepreneurship. So you'll see the labor class go to the owner class. And I think that's something that we haven't seen in human history.
Evan, sorry, I beg your pardon.
So just building on the agent point, so we've got an agentic system in our platform for managing cross-border trade. And obviously in this environment, that's a helpful thing to have. The reason I want to build on your point and then highlight an interesting dynamic. So, if you're moving goods across a border, you have to figure out the customs classifications and then the duties and permits that come off of that. And then of course the tariffs, right? And so over the last few months, you have this incredible shock to the system, all this new complexity, and so business as usual is just kind of broken. And the humans with that job in the logistics business or in the enterprise business who move these goods, they're called customs brokers. They're licensed professionals that read the trade law and they make these determinations and they figure out what things are classified and how. So we have a system where we manage the product master data, like looks at the whole supply chain, and it goes through all that reasoning of how things should be classified and which tariffs apply under what valuation rules, and it's going over hundreds of pages of underlying text and so on and so forth. Now, the reason I bring it up is two points. It's turning the customs brokers who are still in the loop, right? They are our customers, right? We work with the biggest retailers, the biggest logistics companies in the world. It's turning them into managers and not knowledge workers.
Yeah.
And I think that's going to be a trend. I think the other thing that this surfaces is the law says that a licensed customs broker must be the final sign-off on one of these determinations. And so the system we've designed necessarily puts the ultimate decision. Now they can bulk select and based on the confidence just kind of attest to it, but it still puts the human in the decision-making loop because the law says so. Mm-hmm. But all that work, with few exceptions, where it's asking questions of a human here or there, all that work is just happening under the hood. So the product experiences we're building around agents are increasingly putting the user in the role of manager of knowledge work and not the doer of the knowledge work.
Interesting. Secretary, you wanted to?
Yes, going back to your point about regulations, these regulations that have been in the books for so long, we are still following, as a country, labor laws that were made in 1934. And talk about overtime and definitions as to who gets overtime. There's actually rules about key punch operators that they are exempt workers.
Oh, that's interesting.
So that what happens is that the regulations are not aligned. And so that's going to slow down the transformation. And also the silos and the current organizational pillars that we have, and also fragmentation of the databases. Because you get power, superpower, from the conglomeration of this tremendous database, but what happens if they're still fragmented? And lastly, as we all know, is there are institutional organizations that are very concerned about protecting their workers from certain infringements. So we have to bring them along as well, and that's why it's going to take time. Yeah. And that's why whatever we do, number one, we'll have time. Number two, we have to do it carefully. Because there's so much we don't know, and that's just what I'm concerned about, is that we act too quickly, and we don't know what we don't know, and then implement regulations or whatever that actually harm the development.
So I'm going to turn to some of the questions here. We've got some great questions, and this is, referring back to, you were talking, Catherine, about the idea of doing more around physical work. Yeah. And so this question is, if we automate thinking jobs, thinking and doing jobs, are we prepared for the backlash? I mean, I don't think we can not try and apply technologies like AI to things like manufacturing, though, right?
Oh no, and I think when we talk about automation, I think sometimes people think that humans are going to be completely removed from the calculus. And I think one of the companies that I work very closely with, Hadrian, is a perfect example of bringing automation into a machine shop to build critical aerospace and defense parts. You'll hear from Chris today, but it's a good example of it's actually a workforce development to have AI enabling a human. So it used to be that you'd have to study as an apprentice under a skilled machinist for 3 years to be able to machine an aerospace part that goes on a starship. Now you can do it for 30 days. And Chris has many examples of people he's brought in from Chipotle or former school bus drivers who've learned how to machine a part in 30 to 60 days because the artificial intelligence and the software they've built is so critical to how the factory runs. And so I think we're going to see more and more of that. When we talk about complete automation or bringing automation into these industries, the human's always going to be incredibly necessary. These are very complex, and I think in some ways, founders who are building hardware businesses recognize just how important the humans are, but they're being superpowered by these AI products that can help them build. And so I think that's a perfect example of what we're just going to see more of in the physical world.
Yeah. Well, you talk about backlash, and from a general workforce point of view, high level, overall, I think the workforce is going to change. There'll be new jobs created, but it won't be the same person. So the individual impact, the same person who changes from one to the other. You made a great example about pointing out to the truck drivers, but there will be those on an individualized basis who will lose and who will gain. And I think that's where the backlash is going to come, because we are a representative democracy. The second thing I wanted to mention, we talked about national security. That's actually fraught with a lot of challenges, because policies according to national security will follow one path. Mm-hmm. And they sometimes conflict with the best of intentions with other long-held values in our system, in our country. Right. And so how do we balance all of that within our country? I think that's going to be a challenge.
Do you think we're getting the balance right when it comes to competing with?
Well, I think even now, and I'm not being political, but if indeed national security is the goal, there are many things that are happening in a policy point of view that don't seem to coalesce or align with that goal. So the left hand needs to know what the right hand is doing, and they need to work together.
Right. Elad, I want to ask your views on the international picture. There's presumably from the companies you worked at, they often rely on international talent, right? And we're having this discussion around visas and so on. What are we risking, throwing the baby out with the bathwater with doing some of these things?
Yeah, I think in general, there's sort of 3 or 4 different dynamics all happening simultaneously. On the one hand, I think the US has definitely benefited from waves of immigration of different forms over time. I'm an immigrant myself. I moved when I was 5 weeks old to the country, and I'm very happy that I got naturalized here. So I'm very happy to be an American citizen as part of all this. The flip side of it is I do think that for a while we've neglected sort of homegrown American labor in different forms as well. And ensuring that we have the programs and abilities to actually find the best and brightest within our own country in a more effective manner, I think is incredibly important as well, and I think that's been a bit neglected. I think from an AI perspective, one of the things that I think is fascinating is if you think ahead 10 years or 20 years or whatever it is, and you already see some behavior shifting in terms of how people are interacting with some of the different AI tools that exist today, like ChatGPT. So if you look at some of the major use cases and how they've shifted even over the last year, a lot of people are going to AI for psychological help,
Right.
for educational capabilities. So I know some people who will use it in voice mode and ask an AI to tutor them on different subjects. And they'll ask question after question, they'll be tutored on different things and learn from that. So imagine you go ahead 10 years or 20 years or whatever the right time frame is, and every child grows up with an AI tutor helping them one-on-one.
Right.
And it teaches them at their own pace. It helps them explore different topics. It phrases things in the context of what they like. It helps accelerate and push them in different ways. That's an amazing world. If you think of the benefits of just one-on-one tutoring through every study that you can possibly look at. And so one of the things I'm very excited about is this lift of human capabilities through this new technology and this lift in terms of global education access. And so I think that's one of the most important things that's under-discussed relative to this coming impact of AI.
Yeah, we're sort of low on time. That's a really good note to come back to because we've naturally gone to the importance of education and how we empower our workforce. And I think there is a role that AI can certainly play there. I want to finish though by asking one of the topics in Silicon Valley right now is AGI. Is the idea of AI that can do everything. How do we factor that? How do we even think about that? Does anybody?
I disagree with it. I think people are important, and I hope that we have a future generation of people, young people, who actually like to talk to one another.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll talk
I think
AI
it's
as well.
revealing. I think it's revealing that AI has a capability of being your individual psychiatrist.
Yeah.
Is that good or bad? I don't know.
We should probably find out.
We'll find out.
The one thing I would add on this topic really quickly is if you look at gaming as an example, because one of the earliest applications of AI was to games. And so in the 90s, I think Deep Blue from IBM beat the world champion at chess.
Yeah.
And people said, oh, it's just chess. Go is a much more complicated game. AI will never beat people at Go. A few years later, AI beats the world's best Go masters, who now study AI games to learn from it. And they say, well, it's Go. It'll never beat people at poker because poker, there's bluffing, there's betting, there's different behaviors, et cetera. And then this team that Norm Brown led beat people at poker. It beat all the world's best poker players. And they said, well, there are these games called diplomacy, where you're manipulating people, and AI will never beat anybody at diplomacy. That's the final bar. And a few years ago, diplomacy was solved. And so very consistently, we've said, at least in gaming, that AI will never get better at us than X, and it's consistently been better at us than X. And so I do think as we think through every single field, the question is, what are the fields that aren't going to be addressable in the same manner? And it's a matter of time, again, right? It's not necessarily if statement, it's a when statement. And so that's the thing I kind of wonder is like, okay, what's the time frames on some of these things? And then related to that, I have 2 small kids. I always think, well, what should I tell them to go study? Like what's durable in the face of this massive technology change? And I think it's a really interesting question.
Do you have an idea of what to study? I have a kid as well. I'd love to know.
I would open it up to the rest of the panel.
Well, actually, in the interest of time, I think we're going to have to wrap up. But maybe we'll be back in a couple of years with an AI on stage to ask we can ask some questions then. So I really enjoyed that. Thank you, everybody. Please give them a round of applause. Thank you so much.